Pancakes After Midnight. Chapter 1. I'd been married for 6 years, and apart for 4 of them while I was handling a gun for my country, and I suppose what happened can be traced to that. We'd had less than a year before I went into the service, and a little more than a year since I'd been discharged. And we had no children. Perhaps, too, we had too much, well, call it ambition, though greed might be a better word. But, as Ruth said, if we couldn't make it now, when could we? We were making it. Ruth was a secretary to the vice president at Alcuna, at 75 every week. I was working a 6 to midnight shift at Newton Press, and writing features at home the rest of the night. I'd get home about 12:30, pound the laptop until 5:30, and then hit the hay. I was selling about 3/4 of my production, and beginning to get a few fiction sales, too. It made a long night, working like that. I left for work about 20 minutes after Ruth got home after work. She would be sleeping when I was tapping the machine. And in the morning, I never even saw her take off for the office. It made a long, lonely night, but we were banking plenty, and that was some compensation. Or so I thought at the time. I was working a 6-day week, but we had our Sundays. Most of them we spent out at the Grove, watching our house take shape. It was taking shape more slowly than we'd hoped or expected. It was being built by a small-time contractor and he simply couldn't get the materials. First it was soil pipe and then BX cable and then plaster board. I pulled what wires I could, and so did Ruth, through the firm, and we got past these obstacles all right. Though not without some strain on our patience. Ruth got pretty discouraged about it. She said, one Sunday morning, "Let's not go out to the house, today, Greg. We just build ourselves up to a big letdown, every week." She looked tired. She had the kind of delicate blonde beauty that's ravished by fatigue, and she was looking washed out. "A day in the country is just what you need, honey," I told her. "We'll ignore the house and plan the garden." She said wearily, "I can't think of anything I'll ever need less than a day in the country. Lord knows there'll be enough of them, after the house is done." There was an edge to her voice. There was a petulance in her face that made me believe it wasn't only her weariness talking. I said easily, "Want to sell it? We could probably get our money back, and more." She regarded me questioningly. "Do you?" She had a quality in her voice that disturbed me, as though she was hoping I'd been serious. "Of course not," I said. "And you know you won't, either, after you feel better. It's just been so discouraging." Her smile was purely muscular. "You believe just what you want to believe, don't you?" "No," I said. "I don't get you, Ruth. You were just as enthused about the house as I was at first." "Because you were," she corrected me. "Because you'd spent 4 years living out of a barracks bag and worse, and I thought you had a home coming to you, a home in the country." Her voice was more than petulant now, it was acid. I thought I could take it, then. I was still full of that patriotic fever. But I know now that it would bore me to death. I didn't say anything for seconds, because I couldn't. Finally, I said, "I'll see about selling it. I'll talk to the contractor tomorrow." And I stared at her, across the breakfast table, hating her for the first time in my life, wanting to reach over and slap her. "Suit yourself," she said. Her voice was flat with unconcern. I went out a few minutes later. The silence in the apartment was heavy. I felt futile and restless. I thought back, for the first time, to the 4-year separation, to the doubts and suspicions so many servicemen had borne. I hadn't been immune. I didn't really know her, not like a man should know his wife. I had never seen this side of her, until today. I had no particular place in mind to go when I left the apartment. I just wanted to get out. I walked up to Prospect, and down to Kane. Out in front of his cottage, Joe Butler was watering his lawn. He looked up as I approached, and grinned at me. Such a nice day, and such a sour face. Brain stuck? Joe had been on the police force a few years. He wrote true detective stories now. He was a big lug, about my own age, an easygoing gent, and a bachelor. I went into the yard, and sat down on his front steps. "The laptop's okay," I said. "Just had my first marital battle. It's an unusual experience." He turned off the hose. "I'll get us a couple cans of beer," he said. He went past me into the house, and in a few moments he was back. He handed me a can of beer, and said, "Nothing serious, I hope. Only that Ruth doesn't want to live in the country. After all the sweating I've done to get that house as far along as it is, she tells me she'd be bored to death out there." Joe shook his head. "Women," he said. Maybe she's just fed up with all the delay. No. No, she was very definite about it. It was my idea all along, and she didn't want to say anything before this. It's a hell of a time to speak up, if you ask me. Joe's eyes were thoughtful. Well, he said, you won't lose any money on the place, the way costs are rising. You think I should sell it? You think I should give in? He shrugged. I couldn't decide that for you, Greg. Isn't that what you planned? Frankly, yes. That's what I told Ruth, too. I just wondered if it's the logical thing to do. Joe's smile was wry. For a married man, speaking as a confidant of many married men, that's the logical thing to do. He put a hand on my shoulder. There'll be other houses, Greg. And at better prices. Now's the time to salt your dough. I suppose, I said. Only it's been my, dream, I suppose. She really pisses me off when I found out how she felt. How's the writing going? He asked. Fair enough. And you? Peddled 2 this week. That'll keep me a couple months. A writer should be single, I said. Go where he damn pleases, eat beans, if he has to, work full time. That's dangerous talk, Joe said. Why don't you phone Ruth, and tell her to come over? I'll cook a couple steaks in the backyard, and you two can bury the hatchet. Nix, I said. Don't sulk, he told me. It's bad for your artistic temperament. Come on, you're a big boy, now. I shook my head. It wasn't only the things she said, Joe, it was the way she said them. Shit, she was so callous, as though I was some nitwit she'd been tolerating too long. It's more than the house, it's her whole attitude. His voice was grave now. Look, Greg, you're not going to find many like Ruth. Don't blow this thing into a major crisis just because you had your heart wrapped up in that house. She's been working hard, remember, and the way you've been living hasn't been too satisfactory. There wasn't anything I could tell him, no way I could explain about the sharpness of her voice, the nastiness in it. I said. I'm not going to call her. Not feeling the way I do now. He looked like he was ready to protest some more, but he evidently changed his mind. We talked about markets for a while, and some cases Joe had sold, about the next meeting of the club. He said. You're almost ready to try it full time. Why don't you take the jump? Not with Ruth making 75 fish a week, I answered. Jade feel like Gigolo George. She could quit, he said. She wouldn't. She likes nice clothes, and she wouldn't get them on my money, not at first. Maybe not, he agreed, but you can't go on like this. You'll wind up in the bug house. He got up, and went into the house. When he came back, he had a couple more cans of beer. We drank those without much dialogue, watching the traffic move by. I left soon after that. When I got back to the apartment, Ruth wasn't there. She'd left a note. Mr. Allen had some reports that he wanted checked today. I probably won't be home until tonight. She hadn't bothered to sign it, nor add the usual love. Which meant her mood hadn't changed. Nor had mine. A faint suspicion grew in me, and I considered phoning Allen to confirm the note. This was too coincidental. I leave the house in a peeve and she gets a call from the boss. I didn't call him. I settled down with a bottle of rye and the Sunday paper. By 4 o'clock, I'd read the paper right through to the personals, and the rye was gone. The apartment was quiet with that blue Sunday quiet. I could just hear the ball game on the radio next door, and the hum of traffic up on Prospect. I sat there feeling sorry for myself, my mind going back over the 4-year separation, building up a grievance. The months she hadn't written. The letters I'd had telling of this spot and that she'd visited. All in fun, of course, these dates, strictly business. The gents who'd phoned, the first week I was home, and had quit since. The nights, in the past year, I'd smelled liquor in the house when I came home. It was a combination of these memories and the morning's disappointment and the day's dullness that worked me into a stew. Anyway, it was a good excuse. At 5, I went out to eat, and wound up in a bar. At 7, I was in another bar, in a tougher section of town, and spoiling for a fight. I found it. I'm not sure of the details, but the guy had a lot of left hand and a flat nose, I remember. I also remember landing on the nose, and once on the jaw. The button shot was a right hand, and I had my weight in it. It just bounced off of him. Then somebody pulled the floor out from under me. Chapter 2. When I came to, the flat nose was still in my line of vision. There were a couple of washed-out blue eyes above it, and above the eyes there was a wisp or two of fine hair on an otherwise bald head. "You want some more, eh?" I said, and tried to get up. He grinned at me, and one big paw pinned my shoulder. "Easy, Mac. I used to do this for a living. You don't want to tangle with me." He was right, I didn't. I shook my head gingerly, and looked around. I seemed to be in some kind of storeroom, behind the barroom, on a cot. Kate had a cold, wet towel on my forehead. "What the hell were we fighting about?" I asked him. "Something deep," he said. "I think it was the United Nations. You were sure stewed." "I still am," I told him. "We behind the barroom?" He nodded. "Think you can navigate?" "I can try," I said, and sat up slowly. The ball bearings in my brain rolled toward the front of my skull, and I waited a moment for them to come to rest there. Then I swung my feet off the cot. Kate said, "Let's go out the back door. This is a crummy joint, anyway." He grinned slyly. "Besides, we'll have to pay if we go out through the bar." I handed him a 10. "Pay him, first, and we'll go out the back. I don't want anyone left in front to see how bad I must look." Light glimmered in the pale eyes. "You got some more like that, Mac?" he asked me. "A few. The night's a pup," he said, "unless you don't feel up to it." "A little fresh air, and I'll be ready," I assured him. "Go and pay that bartender." He went through the door, and I got to my feet. My legs were all right. The buzzing in my head was annoying, but my legs were sound, and that's my barometer on a binge. Cade came back with the change, and we went out past some cases of bottled beer, through a narrow door that led into an alley. I didn't know Cade from a load of hay, and if he wanted my money, this could have been his chance. He led the way out of the alley. The air was damp and fresh, and I filled my lungs with it. My stomach settled, but my head was still full of marbles. I could see everything. The memory of the alley and the street is still vivid. I just couldn't think. That's the way it went the rest of the night. We hit some high spots and some low, and my vision remained clear, my legs around. But my brain wouldn't mesh. I didn't know a street or even what general locality we were in at any time. We were in a cheap rooming house room, toward morning, drinking out of a bottle. "It must have been Cade's room," I said. "It won't work, chum. I can't get drunk, no matter how much I drink. I may as well go home." "Sure," he said. "I'll call you a cab." Then he frowned. "Hey, we got any money left?" We had 12 cents left, it developed. "Don't give it a thought," Cade said. "I'll take care of everything." About 3 minutes after that, I was being transported home in a Chevy that was at least 20 years old, and maybe more. It was a friend's car, Cade explained, and the friend was asleep. We traveled past a tannery, I remember, and a box factory. It was light out now, but there wasn't much traffic. We made time in that puddle jumper. Then we were in front of my apartment, and Cade was holding the door open for me. "Here you are, sir." "Check," I said, and held out my hand. "It's been a fine evening. I'll see you again, chum." "Sure, I'll be seeing you around," he agreed. "Don't lead with your chin, next time." A wave, and he was clattering off down the street. Or flight up. There's an elevator, self-service, but that was too complicated for me now. I went up the stairs slowly, and down the hall to my apartment. I thought I heard a footstep inside the apartment, and I had visions of Ruth waiting up for me. I opened the door slowly, and threw in my hat. No response, and I pushed the door open all the way. My hat was in the center of the living room rug. Slightly to the right of it, Ruth was lying, face up. There was blood all over her face, and the upper half of her forehead was crushed, and thick with blood. For the second time that night, I passed out. When I came to, there was a face looking into mine again, but it wasn't Cade's. It was a small, thin face with sharp black eyes. A voice somewhere to the right and behind the face said, "He coming too, Doc?" The small face turned away from me. "Right. He smells like a distillery. Probably came home in a drunken rage and..." The other voice said, "That's my department, Doc. You're too fast with conclusion." "Which makes it another of this city's unsolved cases," the doctor said, and his small face went away. And I saw, too, then, that Ruth's body had been taken away, while I was out. The face that replaced the small one was a lot bigger, and heavier. It was the cynical, hard face of a detective, I felt sure. "Sergeant Warner, out of homicide," he said. Think you can sit up, all right? I was on the davenport. I sat up slowly, my stomach on the feather edge of the heaves. Your name? Gregory Jenkins, I said. I live here. The woman on the floor was my wife. What did you hit her with? I just stared at him, while the blood pounded through my brain. He returned the stare, neither concern nor malice on his face. Don't you want to talk? I came home, and found her like that, I said. I'd been drinking all night, and when I saw her, I passed out. The sergeant's eyes covered my face, and then he looked over toward the spot where Ruth had lain. You were wearing a hat? I nodded. I thought I heard her moving around in here, so I threw my hat in first, just a gag. I was drunk. You thought your wife was waiting up? That's right. I fought off another attack of nausea, and felt the surge of one I knew I couldn't fight. I got up, and headed for the bathroom. When I came back into the living room, Sergeant Warner was still sitting on the davenport. The little doctor was standing in front of him, talking to him. I heard the doctor say. About 4 hours, though it's hard to be sure yet. I'll know more, later. The sergeant looked at his watch. It's after 5, now. Let's call it around 1, until we can be sure. The doctor left, and Warner indicated the space next to him on the davenport. I sat down. What time did you get home? I don't know. It was light out. This morning, you mean? That's right. It's been light for only an hour, or so. I couldn't have been out for long. I took a deep breath. Sergeant, I suppose you have to question me. But couldn't it wait? It's been a rough night. He looked down at his hands. You'll have to understand, Jenkins, that in a case of this kind, personal feelings can't interfere. I'm not going to take any more of your time than is absolutely necessary. The questioning went on, and I answered as well as I could. The first shock of seeing Ruth, there on the floor, the amount of alcohol I'd consumed had dulled the impact. But as the time grew longer, the fact of her death began to get through to me. I was a trembling, raw, nerved wreck before Warner was through. I couldn't blame him much for hammering at me. I hadn't remembered a single bar nor street to name, and I knew my companion only as Cade, which was my title for him. I expected the sergeant to run me in, but he didn't. When he left, he said, "Get some sleep. I'll phone when I want you down at headquarters. If you've got a lawyer, it might be in your interest to give him a call." I didn't take off my clothes. I made the bedroom, and flopped across the bed, fighting my jittery nerves. There was no sense of loss, not yet. Maybe it was the alcohol, I like to think it was. A man should miss his wife. I didn't expect to sleep, but I did. It was a sleep full of dreams, and in one of the dreams, I was standing on a platform addressing a crowd, and I was saying, a writer should be single. At 11, I got up to take a shower, to shave. After that, some coffee. The apartment was quiet, too damned quiet. I went to the window, and saw the department car parked across the street. That's why Warner hadn't run me in, last night. This had been as safe as jail. Alan. I wondered if Warner had checked him by now, if he'd learned what time Ruth had left Alan. And where had they checked the reports? At home or the office? If she'd gone to see him. I sat around for an hour staring at nothing and thinking of everything, while the shakes came back. Lord, this place was quiet. I heard the noon whistles, and the increased hum of traffic up on Prospect. At 12:30, I phoned Joe Butler. I asked him, "Have you heard what happened?" "I have. I'm shocked, Greg. Warner was here, a couple hours ago, and he told me about it. He's checking my story." "That's right. He's a hard worker, Greg. I don't think he ever sleeps." "He figures me, doesn't he? Did he tell you anything?" "He doesn't tell anybody anything. I don't know who he figures, Greg, but he can't overlook any angles." A silence, and then, "I want to see you later. I'll let you know when it's time." I tried to eat something after that, but couldn't. There was no grief in me. There was a great shame because of the lack of grief. I tried to tell myself I was still under shock, but that was just rationalizing. We'd grown too far apart, Ruth and I, through the long nights. We'd had only the one common interest, really, and that was the house. She'd destroyed that bond with her scorn, yesterday morning. At 2, Warner came. His face was gray with fatigue, his voice was flatly weary. "You've made arrangements for the funeral?" "No. I haven't been." He didn't help out with any sign that he understood. He just waited. The shock, I said. And maybe the alcohol. I didn't say anything. I've checked with Mr. Allen, he went on. Your wife left his house at 5:30. His chauffeur drove her to the bus terminal at that time. He got up, went over to stand near one of the windows. Your memory any better now? He was looking out the window. He turned to face me. A guy you call Cade, who used to be a fighter, whose friend has an old Chevy, who lives on a route from here that passes a tannery and a box factory. That's your alibi, and that alone. This is one hell of a big town, Jenkins. You'd better search your mind. Alibi? I said. I need an alibi? He nodded. For what time, Sergeant? 11 to 11:30, last night. I was drinking. That much I'll guarantee you. I was with this fighter. I couldn't tell you where. He didn't say anything for a moment. Finally he said. You don't seem near as broken up about this as you ought to be, Jenkins. You and your wife getting along all right, were you? I paused, then said. Up until yesterday morning. We didn't quarrel. But I wasn't in a good mood when I left the apartment. What did you quarrel about? It wasn't a quarrel, I said. It was just her attitude about this house we're having built, out in Elm Grove. I thought she was all for it, but yesterday morning she told me living out there would be too boring for her. Life in town here wasn't boring for her, eh? I looked up quickly at the tone in his voice. I don't get you, Sergeant. She had a lot of friends in town, didn't she? Not many, not that I know of. I paused. What's on your mind, Sergeant? A murder. His gaze met mine. She lived here most of her life, didn't she? The last 12 years. Must have a former boyfriend or two around. I didn't say anything. Don't get me wrong, he said. But it wasn't robbery, and she was wearing a full 1-carat diamond. It wasn't anything else. So if it wasn't a boyfriend, we come back to where we started. To me. To you. Well, run me in then, I said. I've told you all I'm able to tell you. There isn't another damn thing I can do for you. Warner studied me for seconds. Yes, you can, he said then. You can help me. If you're innocent, Jenkins, you can help me find the person who was responsible for what happened. How so? By giving me all the background of your wife's life. By telling me what kind of a crowd she was hanging around with while you were in the service. I want some names. I haven't any, I said. She'd mention a name in her letters from time to time, but rarely. I didn't keep the letters. Again, he studied me. And this time he shook his head. I can't think of a reason in the world why I should believe you. But I do, almost. He rose. Okay, try to remember what you can. Don't do anything stupid. I'll be back. I walked with him to the door. There he told me. And you'd better make some arrangements for the funeral. He left me, and I went to the phone in the hall. In the classified section, I found a funeral director. I phoned, explained, and hung up. She had no parents, and I had none. Her friends weren't my friends scarcely knew her. I went through it all like a man planning a formal dinner, knowing this was no way to feel shame deep within me, but no grief. It will come, I thought. I don't realize what's happened yet. I'll miss her, before many days have passed. Chapter 3. It was 3 o'clock now, and I phoned the shop to tell them I wouldn't be coming in for a few days. I phoned to tell them that, but when I had the boss on the wire, I said. I won't be back at all anymore, Chet. I'm quitting. A silence. Then he said. I read the papers, Greg. We're all damn sorry. If there's anything any of the boys can do, just let us know. Thanks, Chet, I said. I guess there's nothing anybody can do. I hung up, and went over to look out the window. Today, I'd planned on phoning the realtor, to sell the house. But I wouldn't need to sell it now. I wouldn't be going to work tonight. A writer should be single. Rotten thoughts, these. I forced my mind back to the pre-war years, to the year I'd gone with her, and the year of our marriage before the war, to the clubs and the shows, to the nights alone, before the lonely nights. Ruth, beautiful, delicate, moody, expensive, ambitious. Warm enough for all that. Ruth, now cold and dead. The quiet of the place seemed to be piling up, like water behind a dam, ready to burst through. The trembling started again in my hands, and I lighted a cigarette. It was warm out, a humid, breezeless day. It was summer, and the grove behind the house in the country would be softly, coolly green, the oak in the front yard would be shading the door and most of the front lawn. It would be quiet up there, too, but a different kind of quiet. There was plastering to be done up there, and painting, some plumbing still unfinished. After the funeral I could go live in one of the rooms. But I knew I wouldn't. I knew I'd stay in town until Ruth's murderer was discovered or until apprehending him seemed hopeless. I'd be doing what Warner wanted me to do. About 4:30, Joe came over. His face was grave. There seemed to be an embarrassed tension in his manner. "Anything I can do, Greg?" he asked me. I thought for a moment, and said, "You can. You can tell me what you know about Ruth's friends, if anything. You were here, during the war. You must have seen her around, from time to time." His apparent embarrassment increased. "I didn't think it was any of my business, Greg." He kept looking at me steadily, and there was no mistaking his meaning. "I can take it," I said. His eyes still held mine. "A guy named Tony Parker," he said then. "I'm not saying there was anything wrong, but Ruth spent a lot of time with him. Maybe she was only working with him. Tony was doing all right, during the war. Nylons and sugar stamps and tires. Just an angle shooter. Ruth was working with him on stuff like that?" He nodded. "She should have made some money. Of course, she spent a lot. Clothes, and jewelry." Joe nodded again. "I told Warner about this Parker." "That's all right," I said. "I remember her mentioning him a couple times. But she said, I think, that he was a friend of Alan's." "He is," Joe told me. "I don't think Alan was mixed up in that stuff, though. He's a pretty solid citizen, Greg. That he was. One of the town's leading philanthropists, and a civic-minded character. But that wouldn't mean he didn't appreciate a fast dollar." "I'm going to check those gents," I said. "I want to know about those years." "I'll do what I can," Joe said. "I'll go along with you, if you wish, Greg." He paused. "Especially if you go up against that Parker. He thinks he's pretty rough." "I'll let you know," I said. "I want to see Alan, first." "All right." He rose, and looked at me doubtfully. "I'm sorry I had to be the one to tell you this. I never would have if." He shrugged. It was nearly 5 now, and I phoned the Alcuna Corporation, and was told that Mr. Allen had already left for home. He lived out in River Hills, I knew, so I decided to take the car. It was a new car and Ruth had finagled it, somehow. I realized, now, that it hadn't been just luck. The garage was an oven, and the car no better. Once I got on the outer drive, though, the breeze from the lake was cooling. I took my time on the trip, planning my words, trying to remember all that Ruth had told me about Alan in her letters, and since. Alcuna had boomed, during the war. They worked in magnesium and aluminum. I understood from Ruth that they hadn't fared so badly since the war, either. Steel was hard to get, but aluminum was plentiful, and they'd gone into fields where steel had formerly been king. The Allen house was new, a ranch-type structure of whitewashed brick, huge and informal. A middle-aged maid answered the door. "My name," I told her, "is Gregory Jenkins. I'd like to see Mr. Allen." "Mr. Allen is not at home," she said. "If you'll wait, sir, I will find out when he is expected." When she returned, she said, "Will you come in, sir? Mr. Allen is expected home shortly." I followed her into a huge living room, 2 walls of which were almost entirely window. A third wall was dominated by a low, impressively wide fireplace. The svelte brunette mixing a drink at a liquor cabinet near the 4th wall would be considered the room's point of interest, though. She was definitely under 30, and I was surprised when she said, "I'm Mrs. Allen, Mr. Jenkins. Can I offer you a drink?" The memory of the morning's nausea was too fresh. "No, thank you," I said. He was told, at the company, that Mr. Allen had left for home, or I wouldn't have bothered him here. "It's no bother," she said. "Won't you sit down, Mr. Jenkins?" I sat in an armless chartreuse chair pale. She finished mixing a whiskey and soda. When she'd finished, she came over to sit on a circular sofa, nearby. She said, "You were Ruth's husband, Mr. Jenkins?" I nodded. Her dark eyes were quite candidly searching my face. "I can't seem to believe what's happened. She was so cheerful when she left here, yesterday." She sipped her drink. "It's been a terrible shock to both of us." She sounded like a woman trying to make a point, but I didn't get it. I couldn't think of anything to say. Mrs. Allen was showing a lot of interest in her drink. "It's about what happened?" That's why you came to see my husband? I nodded. I thought he might know something he wouldn't reveal to the police. She glanced at me sharply. I'm sure he doesn't. Are you suggesting there was something in their relationship besides business? Not at all, I answered. I came to see your husband about another man. I wanted some information on a man named Tony Parker. She froze, staring at me stupidly. Tony? What possible connection could he have with? She broke off. I wouldn't talk about Tony Parker to my husband, Mr. Jenkins. It's a taboo subject around here. I thought he was a friend of your husband's. Her chin lifted. No, she said quietly, Tony is a friend of mine. Defiance in her stare, defiance and confession. I said nothing. Something else in her eyes, now, a pleading. Please, Mr. Jenkins, nothing about Tony to my husband. I heard footsteps on the tile of the entrance hall now and Mrs. Allen turned that way. The man who stood in the entrance to the living room was a fairly thin man, and tall, about 50. I don't know why I should have expected something different, but I had. This gent was almost too handsome, despite his years. My husband, Mr. Jenkins, Mrs. Allen said. And to him. Mr. Jenkins wanted to talk to you, Roger. Then, as I rose, she glanced at me abjectly. She feared this man's wrath, it was plain. Well, what was she to me? Just another erring wife, as they say. But I said. I wanted to check the time my wife left here. I thought there might be something else you'd be able to tell me. I glanced at her, and there was gratitude in her eyes. Roger Allen's voice was soft, pleasant. There's nothing I haven't already told the police, Mr. Jenkins. Believe me, if there was anything I could say that would help, I wouldn't hesitate. No matter who was involved. I saw Mrs. Allen stiffen. I asked. Ruth left here around 5:30? He nodded. Exactly. She usually works until 5, you know, and she remarked that she'd put in a half hour of overtime, and it was too bad she wasn't on an hourly basis. I looked over at Mrs. Allen and back at him. I said. I'll be getting along then. I had hoped there'd be something, some lead. His face was troubled. I'm sorry I couldn't help. This has been a terrible shock to me, too, you understand. Ruth was like a daughter to me. Nobody over 15 would be like a daughter to him. I said goodbye to them both, and left. I drove down the long gravel drive to the highway and turned south, toward town. All fine homes along here, our Gold Coast. But if what I'd just seen was typical, even money couldn't buy fidelity. I should have mentioned Parker to him. It's all right to be a gentleman, but I had a hunch I'd been a sucker. I could go back to town and look up Tony Parker, and get it from his angle. It would have been better, though, to get the relationship from Allen's angle. His wife could have been lying. Perhaps he really was a friend of her husband's, and she'd been covering. When I got back to town, I drove over toward the south side. That was the main manufacturing section. Perhaps if I saw that box factory again, or the tannery, I'd remember the route to Cade's. I found the tannery on Vine, and traveled south on Vine, looking for the box factory. 8 blocks down, I found it. I continued on Vine. Nothing came back to me, it was like a foreign country. I spent the next hour cruising the south side and didn't recognize a single building besides those two. It was nearly 7:30 when I headed for a restaurant. From there, I looked up Parker in the telephone directory. There was only one, an Anthony Parker with an east side address for his residence, and a downtown address for his office. Then I ate, and for the first time that day I read the paper. There was a picture of Ruth on the upper half of the front page. There was a picture of me in uniform some reporter must have stolen. The story under the pictures was headinged, Husband Seeks Alibi in Mystery Slaying. I hadn't until now, but that was newspaper license, supposed. The story went on to tell about my intoxicated condition, and Cade's. An adjective was used every time Ruth's name was mentioned, winsome, blonde, lovely, young. They were really milking the beauty angle. Allen, who was Ruth's employer, was mentioned as a prominent philanthropist and civic leader, his wife as a charming member of the North Shore Colony. Parker wasn't mentioned at all. Chapter 4. Outside, it was dusk. In the restaurant were only a few customers. Loneliness crept into me and grew and grew. My hands started to shake again. I wanted to leave, but I forced myself to finish the meal, to drink 2 cups of coffee and smoke a cigarette. When I left, I was under control, physically, but the loneliness was as distressing as ever. I drove over to Parker's apartment. There was a car parked in front of the building, an Olds convertible that I knew I'd seen somewhere that day. It was a yellow job, with a black canvas top and white wall tires. I had rung Parker's bell when I realized where I'd seen the Olds before today. It had been parked near the garage at the Allen home. The door buzzed almost immediately, and I went up a wide, carpeted stairs to the second floor. A man stood in an open doorway at the end of the hall up here, waiting for me. He was wearing a dressing gown. He wasn't too tall, but he was husky enough, broad across the shoulders, and heavy through the chest. His face was squarish, chiseled, ruggedly handsome. His eyes were a hard black. "Tony Parker?" I asked. He nodded, his eyes never leaving my face. "My name's Jenkins," I said. "Gregory Jenkins." "Oh," he said, and his chin lifted a little. "Come in, Jenkins." Mrs. Allen broke in then. "Relax, Tony. Don't flex your muscles. Mr. Jenkins thought you were a friend of Roger's." Her smile was ironic. "You were a friend of Ruth's, too, weren't you?" I asked. "Is there any reason I shouldn't be looking for you?" "I did some business with your wife. Not recently, however. I haven't even seen her for months." I went into a dim, darkly furnished living room. Mrs. Allen was sitting on the davenport in there, smoking a cigarette and studying the smoke. Parker said, "I believe you two have met." "This afternoon," I admitted. "You went up there to ask about me?" "For one thing." "Why?" His voice was a bit higher. I wasn't sure whether he meant it to be threatening, or not. "Why should you go up there to find out about me?" "Why not?" I looked him over, sizing him up. I'd been a gentleman once today, to protect Mrs. Allen. This time I didn't spare her feelings. "You saw her last week," I told him. "She told me about it, at the time." He colored, and Mrs. Allen's eyes narrowed. He looked at her, and back at me. "I met her on the street. I'd forgotten about that." The brunette was looking daggers. Parker said, "You have a lot of information, haven't you?" "Not enough," I said. "What kind of business was this that concerned Ruth?" "She furnished me with leads for things I had to sell. She knew the kind of people who were prepared to pay the kind of prices I asked. She got a commission." His eyes met mine squarely, as though he were taking the scout oath. "Our relationship was strictly business. I wouldn't be standing here if I thought it was anything else," I told him. "You haven't anything to tell me?" He shook his head. He was looking annoyed. I wondered what he'd be doing if Mrs. Allen wasn't there. He couldn't afford a fight, because a fight would mean the law. She said, "Why don't we all have a drink and talk like civilized people?" I shook my head. "No, thanks. All I came for was information. This is my second blind alley for the day." I started for the door, and Parker said, "Does the law think I'm a friend of Roger Allen's, too?" "They don't confide in me," I said. "I haven't any idea what they think, excepting that I'm their number one man, so far." "You?" His surprise seemed honest. "They think you. I'm their first choice. Drunk, remember." "Look, Jenkins," he said, maybe I went off half-cocked. "I'd no idea you were involved like that." If he read the papers, he couldn't have had any other idea. And he looked like he could read. I wondered about his change of attitude. I got an inkling of it when he said, "You were a right guy when you kept your mouth shut up at Allen's today. I'm the kind of gent who remembers a friend. And I've a connection or two. Keep in touch with me." "Sure," I said. He wasn't going to do me any good, but I had nothing to gain by talking. I said good night to both of them, and left. It was dark out, the moon obscured by clouds, a slight, humid breeze blowing in off the lake. I'd spent a fruitless day and there was no place to go but home. I'd sure met some lemons today. I was dead. I wondered where Cade was. Maybe he was still carrying on. Maybe he'd found another bankroll. Cade was no prize, but after the characters I'd met today, he looked like a minor god. At least he didn't pretend to be something he wasn't. I put the car in the garage, and walked the 2 blocks to the apartment. I took my time. I was in no hurry to get home. When I got within sight of the building, I hesitated. I could go to a show, or a bar. But I'd have to come home eventually. Later, I'd move to the Grove. The halls were dim. In my hall, I saw the shadow at the far end the second I turned from the stairs. I froze right there, as the shadow moved up into the light. It was Cade. He had a thin grin on his battered face. "Mac, you must think I'm some stinker, huh?" I shook my head. "I've just been at the opposite, Cade. You sober?" "Yup. It's a hell of a state, ain't it? He gestured toward my door. Come on, let's get inside. I opened the door, and we went in. The apartment was stifling. I turned on a table lamp and told Cade. I haven't a drop in the house. I'm a hell of a host. He was studying me strangely. What's the matter? I asked him. You don't talk like a man that just lost his wife, he said. His eyes were appraising me, his face grave. I don't feel like one, I said. I don't know what's the matter, Cade. It just hasn't hit me the way it should. His eyes continued their appraisal, and then the grin came. I'm sorry. I should talk. Me, with 3 divorces. And I don't miss any of them. But I figured you were different, Mac. I've been looking for you, I said. I'll bet you have. He sat down on the davenport. You in the clear? You're not in the clink, so you must be clear, huh? I'm not in the clear. But you could put me there. He nodded. He was chewing his lower lip. I meant to stay away. He flushed. I figured you were nothing to me, just a pickup partner for a binge. But, he shook his head. Buddies? I said, and grinned at him, my first for the day. I guess. Look, I saw the paper, and I figured to lay low. You see, I got an assault and battery rap hanging over my head, and the law's been looking for me. Maybe only 3 to 6 months, but the place is murder for me, Mac. He was sweating, his hands were working. I sat just once in my life for 30 days, and it almost got me. Hell, I don't know, he looked up at me. If you need me, though, I can sit. I'd be glad to sit for you, Mac. I said. Let's wait. They haven't charged me yet. How about me going out to get a jug? He held a big hand out. No. We don't want any liquor until this thing's cleaned up. Warner's on it, huh? I nodded. Good man, Cade said. I've been keeping an ear to the ground, figuring there might be a racket angle. I ain't heard a thing. He hesitated, looking at me doubtfully. Boyfriend, maybe? I'd like to think not. You know a Tony Parker? Everybody knows Tony. He in this? I'm not sure. He spent a lot of time with my wife when I was in the service. I went to see him tonight. Cade shook his head. Tony's no killer. Tony's too smart. He stared. But you never can be sure, right? There's always the first time. I agreed to that. Cade sighed, and studied the carpeting. You got something to eat in the joint? I'm starving. Plenty in the ice box, but I'm not much of a cook, I told him. I am, he said. If I hadn't been so handy with my dukes, I'd have made a big-time chef, I'll bet. We went out to the kitchen, and he fried himself a couple of eggs with bacon. He made some coffee. He ate without saying much, looking worried and thoughtful, glancing at me from time to time, as though trying to figure me. When he'd finished eating, I offered him a cigarette, but he shook his head. Only vice I haven't got. Well, I'll be heading out. If you need me, chum, you can call the Circle Bar and ask. Why don't you stay here? I interrupted. There's room. He looked at me doubtfully. Please, I said. I've got the creeps, Cade. I paused. You don't really trust me, do you? You're sober now, and you think differently about me. He shook his head. It's not that. I just keep remembering what happened here and, damn it, Mac, you're so normal, I figured, with a wife like that, you'd be shot to hell. I didn't really know her, I said. I can't act about it. It simply hasn't hit me yet, like I told you. Maybe it will, later. Okay, he said. But if Warner comes nosing around, I'm going to duck. We hit the hay soon after that. It was a long night, full of dreams. The times I woke up, I could hear Cade snoring in the other bed, a welcome, pleasant sound. It was a long night, but not nearly as lonely as the others. Warner came in the morning. Cade stayed in the bedroom. Warner said, I'm giving it today, and that's about all for me on it. The DA wants some action. I think he'd be satisfied with you, Jenkins. He's worried about his record? You'd have to ask him. Any luck in finding that alibi of yours? I didn't even hesitate before saying. 0. And you can't remember any of the bars you hit? I couldn't, but Cade would. I said. I'm getting closer to it, I think. I'm going out to look up some this morning. I've got a hunch. He looked at me wearily, and shook his head. You must have been boiled. He went to the door and turned. You can stop bothering Parker. His alibi is gilt-edged. The door closed behind him. Chapter 5. A few seconds later, Cade came out of the bedroom, and I asked him about the spot we'd visited. I don't remember all of them, he said, but we were in one about 3 blocks from here. Remember that? I didn't, and I said so. I asked. Around what time was that? Around 11. Hell, you were in the washroom for about a half hour. I thought you'd land on me. 3 blocks, a half hour. A writer should be single. Cade said. What's the matter? You sick? What happened? Ruth was killed between 11 and 11:30, I said. He nodded. I read that in the papers. Weren't you in the washroom? I don't remember any washroom, I said. I knew now why he'd been so doubtful last night.
But you'd remember a murder, chum.
Would I? I hope so, Cade. He looked at his hands. If you left there, you left by a window, a small, high window. There's no back door in that washroom. He looked up at me. I checked that, yesterday. And still you came here? He didn't answer that. He said. I'll make breakfast. I'm hungry. He made pancakes. He fried some pork sausages and made the best coffee I'd ever tasted. But I couldn't eat much. If I'd had a memory lapse, Cade was quiet while we washed the dishes. His lumpy face was thoughtful and his pale eyes clouded with concern. As we went back into the living room, he said. Don't tell Warner about that washroom business. He's a good man, but he's only got so much time. It's too easy. Did you talk to the bartender? I asked. Cade nodded. He don't remember a thing. He had one hell of a crowd in there Sunday night. The phone rang, and I answered it. It was Roger Allen. He asked. Have you a little time this morning? I'd like to talk to you. I told him I had plenty time. I'll stop in then, on the way to the office, he said. It'll be about 15 minutes before I'm in town. When I hung up, Cade was watching me. Something cooking? I shrugged. I thought I got nowhere last night, but maybe, stirred up something, at that. It's Roger Allen, Ruth's boss. What did he want? I'll find out in 15 minutes. Cade went back to the bedroom before Allen came. You'd think we was being indiscreet, he complained. It took me some time to find out what Roger Allen wanted. I didn't really see what he was after until he'd left. When he came in, he was tense and nervous. The care he took with his words, you'd think he was looking them up. I want to talk about Ruth, he said, if that's not too callous of me, right now. Go ahead, I said. She got her job with me through my wife, as you probably know. I'm quite sure I know who introduced her to my wife, a man named Tony Parker my wife formerly spent a lot of time with. He studied me. Were you in your wife's confidence completely, Mr. Jenkins? I hesitated, then shook my head. I didn't think so. You seem like a straightforward young man, and judging men is part of my business. I want to speak frankly, Mr. Jenkins. He was watching closely for a reaction. Again I said. Go ahead. Has Ruth ever told you anything about me? I began to burn. Should she have? He stared, and then he said. Oh, Lord, not that, man. You don't think? He shook his head, vexed. I mean, has she ever told you anything about my past? Did she know anything about it? I don't know. She made some remarks lately that led me to think she knew some things I thought were dead. He faced me squarely. If it were anyone else, I'd assume they were the opening remarks to a diplomatic bit of blackmail. He rose. Now, hit me if you want to. You're vulnerable to blackmail? I said. Don't you know? I don't. Parker then. He looked thoughtful. I wonder if he's still in town. He was last night, I said. He looked at me sharply. Have you seen him? Is he connected with what happened? I don't know, I said. I was just looking up some of my wife's friends. Allen looked like a man about to be executed. It's pretty bad? I asked. It's good for 5 years, he said. I'm telling you this, because it will probably break, anyway. I've lived in fear too long to pay blackmail now. He shook his head wearily. I can take it, but my wife. I couldn't think of anything both honest and genuinely comforting to say to that. After he left I was still standing near the door when Cade came out of the bedroom. He was frowning. What the hell kind of mess we in, chum? You think that's got anything to do with your wife? I shrugged. I don't know any more than I ever did. I feel like a puppet, being worked with strings. Everybody I've met in this deal has got too many extracurricular activities. English, please, Cade said. This Parker batting in the Allen League? Who told you about that? A friend of mine, I said. And I'm going to call that friend now, to see if he's home. He used to be a cop. I'm going to tell him everything I know about it, and get his reaction. A cop, Cade said. Isn't one cop enough? If. He never finished the sentence. My doorbell rang for the third time that morning, and I went over to press the buzzer. Grand Central Station, Cade grumbled. You'd think we were playing red light. He went back to the bedroom again. It was Joe Butler. I was just going to phone you, Joe, I said. He seemed to pause, to study me. Trouble? Just information, I said. Who told you about Parker and Mrs. Allen? Again that pause, and I had the damnedest feeling he was scared. Why? I just wondered. And then I remembered it wasn't Parker and Mrs. Allen he had told me about, it was Parker and Mr. Allen. But he hadn't corrected me, just now, so he knew. He knew, and had said nothing. He had described Roger Allen as a solid citizen. He had steered me toward Parker, but away from Allen. Puppets. Joe knew about them. Joe manipulated characters. Parker, the red herring, and Joe knew about those, too. And there was something else Joe knew. I said. You look tired, Joe. Lot of research? Now he was obviously suspicious. What do you mean? What are you driving at? Those True Detective magazines, I said. I studied them for a while. Full of old cases, aren't they? Some of them unsolved, complete with pictures of the principals. Have to dig to find any cases Oat haven't been told about in print before. He didn't say anything. He was staring at me, missing nothing. Is that where you saw Allen's picture? I asked. He had no words, and it was as good as a confession to me. For either my words made no sense at all to him, or I was on the right track. Joe had wanted me to make up with Ruth, yesterday morning. He'd almost insisted. He didn't want her. He must have known she was about ready to dump me, but he didn't want a wife. A writer should be single. Did you introduce Ruth to Parker? I asked. Or just tell her about him? Parker could introduce Ruth to Mrs. Allen and, through her, get the job with Roger Allen. Ruth could be your stooge, then, and find out just how much Allen could and would pay. Am I right, Joe? You're crazy, he said, but his voice was shaky. Am I? Nobody but you seem to know about Mrs. Allen and Parker. You didn't tell me before that you knew it. You just slipped now. You've been drinking, pal, he said. Not today. Did Ruth want you to marry her? Was she going to ask me for a divorce? Is that why, Joe? Did you promise to marry her, when I was in the service, and you were here, backdooring me? You've let your imagination run riot, he said. Calm down. Imagination? I said. Maybe. Most of it. And then I told my lie. But last night, at 11 o'clock, I was in pretty bad shape. I was at a bar, about 3 blocks from here, and I had to come home for more money. It's all been a blank, until a few minutes ago. But I remember coming here now, and I remember seeing you leave here last night around 11. He was white. You were drunk. It's a hallucination. You're guessing. I shook my head. I remember. And my buddy will, too, if I ever find him. Silence, while Joe stared at me. Silence, while I thought of how he'd pulled the strings, and we'd played our parts. Leading me and Warner to Parker. If I hadn't happened to drop in at Joe's Sunday morning, Warner would never have even talked to him. Joe'd been my friend, not Ruth's, I'd thought. Silence, and then I saw Joe's feet move, as he said himself. I ducked, but he caught me along the jaw anyway, and I crashed into the wall. I saw a blur in front of me, and I swung, hitting nothing. Then something crashed my temple, and the lights went out. When I woke up, the flat nose was there again, and the wisp of hair and the faded blue eyes. The grin, too. You sure are a sucker for a left, Cade said. How you feeling, chum? I'll live, I said. How about Butler? Cade inclined his head to the left. Him? He might, and he might not. I saw him smack you, and it kind of burned me, so I worked him over pretty good. He's been babbling like a baby. I wouldn't be surprised if he'll tell Warner everything he wanted to know. Joe did. Though Warner told me. Of course, it was only a question of time before I'd have nailed him, anyway. You see, He left the department under, oh, a cloud, you might say. Nothing we could nail him with, but it smelled of blackmail, and I'd have got the blackmail angle in this, after a while. If you hadn't gone to see him Sunday morning, though, he might never have got into the case. Sure, I said. Sergeant, or me. Alan took his 5-year rap like a man. His name had been Revere, when he'd peddled the phony stock, but the picture had led Joe to him. Kate never served a day. Warner said if there was any charge against him, somebody must have removed it from the files. He couldn't find it. Kate and I are living in the country house now, and I don't think I'll marry again. The end.